I have reason to suspect our home planets may face imminent attack.
Group 3, Vectors 1-7 up to 8.
It's Captain Apollo, sir.
If I run into Cylons, I can lose the entire squadron.
Their scanners will not be able to find us.
Dieter, take command of the squadron. I've got a Cylon on our tail.
Goodbye, Adama. You're finished.
We have a refuge to go to. A refuge that the Cylons know nothing about.
I'm no more Cylon than you are. And you know it.
Aren't you guys Baltar? Yeah, I haven't done anything.
It won't be an easy journey. It'll be long and arduous.
All of this has happened before, and all of it will happen again.
So say we all. 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 So say we all.
Welcome to Journey Through Sci-Fi, with me, James.
And me, Matt. Every series on this podcast, we explore the world of science fiction cinema by taking a trip through a different subgenre of sci-fi.
This series, our journey is through the fantastical world of space opera.
Hello listeners, welcome back to the show. Welcome back to our journey through space opera. Today on the show, we're very excited. We're going to be joined by Val Nolan, who is a lecturer in genre fiction and creative writing, and he's also the co-author of Spec Fic For Newbies, a beginner's guide to writing subgenres of science fiction, fantasy and horror.
And Val also co-authored that book with friend of the pod, Tiffani Angus, who joined us in our last series on dystopias. But as Matt mentioned, we are joined today by Val Nolan to discuss Battlestar Galactica. So we're going to be covering the 1978 series and the 2003 series, and talking about the comparisons, the things they changed, and what happened to space opera in that time period.
Yeah, so let's spin up those FTL drives and go and get Val, James.
Welcome to Journey Through Sci-Fi, Val Nolan. Val, how are you?
I'm very good. Thank you for having me on the show.
Really excited to have this conversation on Battlestar. It's a show which myself and Matt have talked about previously in various bits and pieces, but really excited to delve into this 1978 version and the one from 2003 today. But before we get started with all of that, can you tell the listeners a little bit about yourself, your work, your recent book on spec fiction, and just introduce yourself to our listeners. That'd be great, Val.
I'm a lecturer in genre fiction and creative writing at Aberystwyth University. For years and years, I have met countless students who are obsessed with science fiction and fantasy and comic books and TV shows and movies, almost, and in many cases, more obsessed with them than I am. So that's really a delight. I am one of the very many science fiction nerds who have emerged from rural Ireland in the 80s and the 90s. You wouldn't think there'd be that many of us, but there are. I published a book on Neil Jordan's work, filmmaker and short story writer and novelist. And subsequently, then I have moved more into the area of science fiction criticism and fantasy criticism and comic book criticism. So I have articles in journals like Science Fiction Studies and the Journal of Comic Books and Graphic Novels, Foundation, various things like that. I also write short stories, science fiction stories myself, which is a lot of fun because it's not just the theory, but it's also the practice. It's also getting to put these things into effect on the page. I've had stories in the year's Best Science Fiction, Best of British Science Fiction, many stories in Inner Zone, which I'm very happy to be associated with, many stories in smaller and different, more varied publications as well. And most recently, as you said there, I've co-authored a book with the fantasy novelist Tiffani Angus about writing science fiction, fantasy, and horror, and it's called Spec Fic For Newbies. That has been an awful lot of fun to take what we did in the classroom and put it on the page. And we don't approach it in a very sort of serious way. We're not like, no, you have to do this. There are rules. We're like, no, screw it. I mean, you want to have the monster have like 15 eyes, go for it. It's fine. It's grand. Whatever. We're kind of pitching the book as the next best thing to being in the classroom with us. So it's kind of fun. It's kind of irreverent. It looks at individual subgenres of science fiction, fantasy, and horror. So it kind of does a different thing from this is how you write stories. It's like, no, this is specifically how you write stories about robots, how you write stories about vampires, how you write stories about zombies or big dumb objects. Or these are the very nuanced, granular approaches to things that if you're going to experiment with these genres, this is what you need to know. You get a little bit of history of them. You get some sort of like, this is typical types of robots, or this is typical types of spaceships. And then you get a kind of a look at these are the pitfalls that often affect people. You know, these are the common errors. These are the things to avoid if you're a novice writer. Working on a volume 2 at the moment.
Well, you seem very, very well equipped to help us on today's podcast, because obviously our podcast, we explore different subgenres of science fiction specifically. So given your book and given all of your background knowledge, we're really excited to get you talking about Battlestar today. And in this series, we're specifically looking at space opera as a genre of science fiction. We've done episodes on the early sort of film serials like Flash Gordon and Buck Rogers in the 30s, right through to Star Wars and more modern day versions. But what do you think about space opera as a subgenre? How would you classify it, and what are the key features in your mind of a space opera?
I suppose, and I was thinking about this lately actually, because shockingly, space opera we didn't cover in book 1, but we are covering it in book 2. So I have recently completed drafting that section.
We've got you at just the right time then, haven't we?
Yeah, that's it, exactly. I think space opera to me is a thing that it's beloved and it's scorned in equal measure, and sometimes that happens at the same time with the same property. And you think of something like you guys mentioned, and you did the episode on Flash Gordon, for instance, the 70s movie. Flash Gordon is an awful movie. No. It's amazing. It's wonderful, yes. But it's awful. But it's amazing, yes. And it's all happening at the same time. And I think it's a good barometer for space opera. Space opera it's melodramatic, and it's big battles, and it's crazy aliens, and it's extravagant sort of super weapons and evil empires, and it's almost the bigger the better. And I know there are different ways of looking at this. And you look at the stuff on the page. You look at the more recent stuff in the 90s and the 2000s. You look at new space opera, and they're like, no, we're serious. We're actually a real genre. But at its core, it's ridiculous and it's wonderful. We love it for that. And the whole idea, I suppose, behind even calling it space opera, like the guy who comes up with that, and you guys know this, the guy who came up with that, he was trying to put down the whole genre. It was just a space opera. It's nonsense. It's just like those silly stories for that to be on the radio. But people are just grabbed onto that term and made it not necessarily part of their identity, but part of their core viewership and their core readership. They're like, yeah, we actually love these things that you maybe were trying to say weren't very good, Bob Tucker, back in whenever you coined the term, but actually we love them. So I think to me, space opera is, in some ways, it's the beating heart of science fiction. And I think it's dismissed as childish and low quality. And I suppose, where have we heard things like that before? But also, you wouldn't have the pop cultural landscape that we have today if it wasn't for the pioneers of space opera in the 20s and the 30s and the 40s. The type of things that we see in the Omniplex, the type of thing we see on the TV, the type of things we see in our bookstore, they wouldn't exist now if it really wasn't for space opera. It broke an awful lot of ground. You had people like Edmund Hamilton, you had Doc Smith, you had Lee Brackett, you had these writers, you had Andre Norton, you had these people who were doing these stories way ahead of their time that we're still looking back on today and we're saying, yeah, that was cool, let's do that. But now maybe we look at it with a little bit more seriousness in terms of our aesthetic approach. And I'll put on my professor hat for a second down and be like, oh, our use of language is more sophisticated now, and our characterization is a lot stronger. And these things are all true, but at its heart, it's still a bunch of people on a spaceship. They're probably going to blow something up, and there's probably going to be a huge cliffhanger. Tune in for part 2.
It's such an imaginative genre, isn't it? And I think it's got there's a low barrier of entry to enjoying it. It's the other end of the scale to hard sci-fi, where you are expected to understand what's going on with some pretty complicated scientific concepts some of the time. And space opera just has none of that. So there's this low barrier of entry. Anyone can enjoy it. I think that's why it captures the minds of children. gets it's the gateway drug to sci-fi, isn't it?
Oh, it absolutely is. And I think you're right there in drawing that comparison to hard sci-fi, because when people think of science fiction, and I'm sure you guys have had these conversations with people, they immediately they either think of space opera or they think of hard science fiction. And a lot of times people are willing to conflate these two things together, even though they're quite different. Stylistically, they're different. In terms of intent, they're quite different. I think it was Alistair Reynolds, I think it was the Welsh novelist, he said, who's also a qualified space scientist, who said something like, too much science or too much knowledge of science is the enemy of space opera, because you can't make those imaginative leaps in the same way.
Yes.
If you're writing hard science fiction, it needs to be consistent. It needs to be very, very far away from just reverse the polarity and it'll be fine, move on at that point,
No, definitely. And I think the two TV shows which we're going to be covering today, they are the perfect illustration of that fact, because you've got one which is very gritty and down to earth, and you've got another one which is quite fantastical in nature and goes on a few tangents, to say the least. But let's talk a little bit about this show then. Let's talk about Battlestar Galactica.
There are those who believe that life here began out there, far across the universe, with tribes of humans who may have been the forefathers of the Egyptians, or the Toltecs, or the Mayans. Some believe that there may yet be brothers of man who even now fight to survive somewhere beyond the heavens.
This is the commander. Moments ago, this ship received word of a Cylon attack against our home worlds is underway. How, why, doesn't really matter now. What does matter is that as of this moment, we are at war.
First off, Val, what are your memories of this series? Were you familiar with the original before the remake came out, 2003? Or how did you sort of hear about Battlestar Galactica first off?
I knew the original existed, but if it ever aired on Irish television when I was growing up, I don't think I saw it. We definitely had Buck Rogers was on the television, every Saturday morning ad nauseum, and Flash Gordon would be repeated on the Saturday afternoon, every few years that would be up again. I knew that Battlestar Galactica was there. I knew it was a presence, but it really wasn't until the reboot and the reboot movie or the miniseries or whatever we want to call it from 2003. I was like, oh yeah, actually, let's go back and let's look at that and let's sort of think about that and see, where did this story come from? And as you point out, there one of them is this sort of very fantastical space operatic, very big version of it, and one of it is gritty and down to earth, and it's the same story. Let's be honest about it. Almost beat for beat in some of those sections, it's the same story, and it illustrates, I think, in some ways the permeability of genre or subgenre barriers. They're kind of nonsense to an extent. They're kind of marketing criteria from another perspective. They're the same story in the 78 version and the 03 version, but intent is different. The artistic intent is different. The idea that, yes, we're going to make this thing which is kind of going to be like Star Wars for TV, or we're going to make this thing which is, The West Wing meets 24 in space. And you're like, oh, okay, tone here, you guys are bouncing. Yeah, okay, but it's the same thing. And I think it's a kind of an amazing example. Somebody needs to do maybe some academic work on that in terms of, just how it illustrates that division in the subgenres.
There's like a business question, a business of Hollywood question there as well, which is because it is the same thing, but you're doing you've got a completely different artistic expression that you want to get across in 2003. So then my question becomes, why Battlestar Galactica if I'm Ronald Moore and I want to tell this gritty West Wing meets 24 in space? I don't need Battlestar Galactica to do that, especially if I'm fresh off the back of 7 seasons of DS9. I've got clout in the sci-fi world and in Hollywood, so why Battlestar Galactica, I guess?
Well, I guess it's a known intellectual property, or it was at the time, and it's one of the I'm going to say it's one of the limitations of the Hollywood system, in that if something already exists, people in executive lounges someplace on the 15th floor are much happier to say, yeah, actually, okay, let's go for that. People kind of already know what that is. There'll already be a curiosity about it. There'll already be an intellectual buy-in about it. And Ron Moore, who I respect massively and cannot speak for, seemed to, he says, proceeding to speak for him, seemed to latch out to this and say, yeah, this is the perfect vehicle in every way for me to do my reimagining of what science fiction television can be. And the sheer audacity of someone who, as you say, had just come off, Deep Space Nine, one of the great, television shows of the 1990s, to say, right, actually, science fiction television, let's actually do it properly. And you're like, oh my God, Ron, that's kind of amazing. And someone who would go on then to make, I don't know if anyone is watching For All Mankind at the moment, which is astonishing as a television show. And again,
amazing.
An artistic sort of project. And he approaches it in that way. He says, it's almost like, I want to tell a story. I want to tell the best possible story I can. He looks at science fiction television, both the 70s version of Battlestar Galactica and the material that he was working on at the time in the 90s. And he says, we can do this better. And you look at, I think he did a very short stint on Star Trek Voyager after the end of Deep Space Nine. I think so, yeah. And my understanding is that he looked at how things were running on that show, like the fact that Voyager looks absolutely spick and span every week. There's no sense of continuity there. There's no sense of, it doesn't feel like anything happened on this astonishing voyage that they've been taking across the galaxy. But everything is fine. The carpet's always clean. The wall is always repaired the next episode. Even though it was exploding. And he kind of looked at things like that and he said, actually, hang on. Maybe there is a more realistic way of doing this. And maybe the thing that is, or maybe he thought that the thing that's holding back science fiction television at the time was the fact that he wasn't taking these things quite as seriously or portraying them quite as realistically as they could be. And we see that in something like For All Mankind. We see it in the television version of The Expanse, for instance. That sort of grittier, realistic thing. A lot of that comes from what he was doing at the time here with Battlestar Galactica, and as a response to what he was seeing in the 90s.
Yeah, it's so interesting seeing how that perception of science fiction had changed from the 70s to the 2000s. And like when you take it back to Glen A. Larson, who came up with the original idea, it was originally pitched as a science fiction property to catch up with Star Wars for Universal. So that's why it has Star in the name, because the producers wanted to make it very Star Wars, like cash in on that opportunity. And he's really pitching that. And then you get Ronald Moore coming in later, and then he's, like you say, he's completely divorced from that idea of the space opera. I think he put out a 3-page manifesto or something I read online, and I think some of this got put in the scripts that were sent out for the actual show to actors, because a lot of actors were turned off by the fact it was Battlestar Galactica. So they read that name and they were like, oh, I don't know how I feel about this sort of reboot that you want to do now for the Sci-Fi Channel. But they read that, and I know Edward J. Almos, he read this bit at the beginning, and it says some stuff like they're making a naturalistic science fiction. They're taking the opera out of space opera. Their goal is nothing less than the reinvention of the science fiction television series. So these are big, bold claims you're putting at the start of your scripts. And I think all of that other stuff, which was so much the marketable part of Battlestar Galactica in the 70s, suddenly became a hindrance when they try and reboot it later on. So I think that whole idea is fascinating to look at as well, right?
Yeah, I think you're entirely right on that. I think putting that in the scripts, especially when they were sending them out at the casting stage, I think that was essential, because it's 2002, 2003 when they're filming this, when they're casting this. Science fiction television at the time, and it was great, and I love it, and I'm obsessed with it, was things like Star Trek, was things like Farscape, was these shows that are, it's the rubber-headed aliens, it's the crazy nonsense, it's we're filming on the same cave set again that we filmed the last episode on. It was silly. And if you wanted to get the type of A-list talent that he did, if you want to get people like Mary McDonnell, the people like Eddie Olmos, to get these people to present this gravitas, to present this sense of, it's like, yes, this is a serious drama, you needed to make that very clear at the start. You needed to almost say at the start, this is not the 70s show. This isn't even a 90s show. This is going to be something. Naturalistic science fiction is a way of doing that. But also you need to get people past the title. And I think putting that in the scripts was really important in that, to get the type of people, to get the cast that could carry this and create this version or this image that he had of what science fiction could be.
I have to confess, I was turned off by the title. I did not receive Ron Moore's manifesto. I was not briefed. And I saw all of Battlestar Galactica, the 78 one, and I think Galactica 1980 as well. James, I don't know if you remember, but I think it had the coveted post-Simpsons slot on BBC Two in the 90s.
Yes, I think it did.
So I watched it and that's how I watched all sci-fi in the 90s when I was growing up. But I didn't, I liked it when I was a kid, but I didn't really remember it fondly. And then when this came out, I completely ignored it until about 2007, I think, the year before it ended. A good friend of mine was like, you have to watch it, it's very good, and he gave me the DVDs of the miniseries, and I fully realized I was wrong, but I was turned off by the branding, by the brand Battlestar Galactica. I thought that's going to be cheesy rubbish like the original. I'm just not interested.
Not the only person to think that. I think. I mean, I was like you. I kind of stumbled on it on I think it was on like Sky one evening just when I was home from college or something, and I'd been sort of working my way through Stargate, which they were showing on Sky at the time. Like they'd show an episode or two every evening. I was like, yeah, okay, I will just kick back now and watch this. And then for some, I think it was like a weekend or something, they showed the two parts of the miniseries, and I was like, oh wow, this is amazing. And I did that thing then that your friend did with you, and I was like, I got a copy of the DVD, and I was like, what? And I gave it to one of my friends to watch, and my friend was like, I think he got through maybe about half an hour of the miniseries before he was sort of turned off. He could not see it as like something like Top Gun. He was like, you're the cocky pilot, you're the best pilot on this battle station, but we can't trust you. It was the DVD was returned.
Oh no!
But that's okay. I got to watch it again, so
Oh, he missed out massively.
Yeah, he really
did. Should have carried on with that because it's just so good. And it's just looking at because you talked about the miniseries there, which was the sort of starting point in 2003 when they rebooted it. If you look at the starting point of the 70s version, that was quite an interesting one as well, because the original premise was to have it as these big made-for-TV movies. So each episode I think they were like 3 hours or something they were looking at to do each episode bit of the story. And then because each episode of the show was costing millions of dollars, like I think it was about $1 million to make each TV episode of this original 70s version, which is unheard of at the time. But of course, they're trying to cash in on Star Wars. They're trying to catch up. They had a lot of people that worked on Star Wars work on this as well, like conceptually as well, which was interesting, which did lead to lawsuits, but we'll stay away from that part of it because Lucas and everyone were after people which had anything to do with making a Star Wars influenced product. So they've got these made-for-TV movies, which then subsequently get turned into a proper release in cinemas to help recoup the costs, which is another interesting element. So it's got this kind of cinematic history, even though it's a TV show, and this grand scale and grand budget. So when you guys were rewatching it, did you feel like you were watching a space opera movie?
I think that the first third of it feels like a movie. The first third of it is definitely where all the money went. The first, you've got the Cylon attacks, and you've got the explosions, and you've got the special effects, and you've got the big sort of drama stuff. And then you sort of run into a structural problem. Then you kind of run into okay, we've told sort of our 3 acts of this story now, and let's go again. And at that point, you kind of feel, it's still good fun, but you kind of feel like you see where the stitching is. Now we're going to connect it to a second episode. Now we're going to connect it to a third episode. I think the fact that it was written originally as 3 individual pieces, I think that shows a bit. It shows definitely in things like the repetitions of the special effects shots and so on as you get in the second third and the final third. It stretches out a bit in terms of the storylines as well. It is the same story, but it's 3 separate stories. And by the time you get to the alien mining planet / casino / cantina / whatever it is, that's just its own separate thing entirely. I described it to some of this like Studio 54 in space, but also, but it's also a kids show. And these two things, there's this weird tension between that. It's like, you know, you've got Starbuck being, you know, really sleazy and sort of like hanging around and you know, trying to sleep with anything that moves. And now we're going to cut back to the cute kid and his robot dog, which I think, did somebody say that was a chimpanzee in a suit?
No,
something.
Oh, no.
Yeah, I think so. I don't think they would allow that nowadays. But
absolutely wild.
Yeah, but there's that weird tension in the 70s thing. It's like, yeah, it's kind of trying to be Star Wars, but it's sort of trying to be two separate versions of Star Wars, like a big sort of, you know, this is a big, exciting action adventure thing for adults. And here's a cute kid doing more stuff. I don't mind the cute kid. Actually, I think he's fine. I think the performance is pretty good. But it feels kind of like there's two things pulling against each other in terms of the storytelling across 3 episodes.
Yeah, I agree with that. It's very clearly 3 45-minute segments stitched together, and yeah, that mining planet at the end is where you really feel like I've run into another episode here that I shouldn't be in. That feels completely different, but I quite like the first 2 episode bits of it that are the same story as the 2003 version. But yeah, it doesn't quite feel like a film. And a whole piece in that way. But interestingly, I watched a few more episodes for this. I watched a couple of 2-parters. There's a 2-parter where they find Kobol, and the 2-parter where the Pegasus shows up. So 2 things that they reused wholesale in the 2003-4 series. But I could sort of see how it might have been planned as movies when you just watch those bits. I didn't watch some of the episodes in between. I remember that's where it's a bit more episode of the week and not very good and a bit cheesy. But I can see how if you were planning a series of TV movies, you'd have the destruction of the colonies, that's a TV movie, the finding Kobol and the sort of pyramids at the end of that, and then Pegasus showing up as its own self-contained story. Those work quite well, and I could see it would actually be, I think it would be a better series if it was, you know, trim the fat out of it and make it TV movies and take your $24 million or whatever and spend it on less content and make it better.
Well, that was the plan at one point. They were just going to carry on doing the TV movie format, but I think there were obviously budget constraints, and then I think in the middle of production, they just told the cast, right, we're not doing this anymore. We're doing standalone episodes. Here's your script on the day. Learn your lines. And apparently when you watch some of those standalone episodes that come after the sort of the TV movie ones, you can see the actors thinking about what their next line is because they've literally just been given a script. So that's where it sort of dips. And it's such a shame because they had all of these grand plans, and you can see the grand scale nature of it all. And there is sort of this overarching theme and story that's coming out as the series develops, but they just don't get a chance to do it. And I was really struck by how similar that 2003 miniseries version for Sci-Fi Channel is, because there are certain scenes that are almost direct copies from the original movie, which I just had no idea about.
Yeah, the thing that jumped out at me was the not the first Starbucks scene, but there's like the second Starbucks scene, I want to say, where Starbuck is gambling and has the cigar and the whole thing, and you're like, I've seen this before somehow. Actually, I've seen Katie Sackhoff do this. Actually, the exact same thing, and it put me in mind of the. I will try not to get sued. Of the thing George Lucas once said about the various Star Wars movies and the prequels and the original movies, and he's like, it's like they rhyme.
Oh yeah.
You know, they're sort of in conversation with each other, and I think maybe that's kind of a good way of thinking about the 70s version. And the modern version here, they're sort of in conversation with each other, and they're sort of in conversation with what space opera and what science fiction is and what it can be and what it's trying to say to people at any given time. The thing I noticed as well was the destruction of the colonies. There was a lot more of that on the ground stuff in the 70s version, which kind of surprised me. It was a lot more of, you know, the people running and screaming and the buildings exploding and that sort of stuff. You see the aftermath of it a lot in the modern show, but the actual experience of the people on the ground, there's a bit of Baltar wandering around with his suitcase and so on. But, you know, again, you get that in the 70s one as well. You get the people coming down when they see the spaceships landing. I guess it played well in the trailer for the movie. maybe is why that's there. I'm not entirely certain, but the way in which the scenes were literal reimaginings, and we hear the term reimagining a lot, and we hear, oh, this is a reimagining of this classic property, and it's nothing like it. The modern Battlestar Galactica is almost the perfect example of a reimagining, because it literally says, yeah, that scene or that part of that episode, or even as you say there, Matt, the Pegasus thing or the finding a kobold. So literally, like, how are we going to tell that story in a modern way that is conversant with modern television, with what a modern audience wants, with something that is a bit more serious, maybe a bit more grown up, to do a sort of a grassroots reconstruction of that. I think that's a fascinating kind of creative challenge that the show pulls off very well.
Yeah, I'm still hung up on like the why choose this product to do it, but the end result is fascinating, undeniably, and that being in conversation with Battlestar Galactica in 2003 it's a fascinating end result. I still can't quite get my head around the whole, like, why this product of all the products, but I just can't deny the success of it. And you're right, it's a brilliant example of a reimagining. It must be one of, if not the most successful reimagining of a property. If nothing else, it lasted way longer than the original. It's better. It did better than the first one did, and massively critically acclaimed, and achieves all those things that you were just talking about. It reimagines it in an interesting, engaging way.
Possibly too interesting and imagining at the very end for some people's tastes.
Wow,
that's a whole separate discussion.
Yeah.
Well, that's an interesting aspect of it, isn't it? Because even though it's science fiction, it's got quite a lot of interesting themes running underneath it. One of the things which I didn't realise until doing a bit of reading about it was that Glen Larson was a Mormon, and there's a lot of Mormon themes in this series as well, especially in sort of the original and certain stories. Do you guys know much about that side of it?
I'm not a Mormon, but I know a little bit. I know, the Lord's, the Quorum of 12 is like a thing in Mormonism, and there's a lot of just language sprinkled over the original Battlestar Galactica that comes directly from Mormonism. It's really, everyone's really religious, or most people in Battlestar Galactica are really religious, monotheistically Christian religious. Well, not Christian because they won't have a Christ, but the Judo-Christian, recognizably that kind of religion. There's like specific things like Kobol is a Mormon thing. There's a I think there's a planet called Kolob in Mormonism.
Yeah, it's like an anagram of it, isn't it? It's Kolob, I think, in Mormonism.
Kolob is the Mormon thing, and so all that stuff is like sprinkled over it. And I weirdly, I'm not a religious person, but I have the utmost respect for Glen Larson as a Mormon, just being like, I'm a Mormon, I'm going to stick a load of Mormon stuff in my sci-fi show. Why not? I'm going to get it out there for the people.
Yeah, and I mean, Christianity is always in science fiction in some way or form. There's lots of different religious connotations in lots of different science fiction and different genres in general. So it's just interesting seeing it come to the forefront in this and just being a part of those themes.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting what Larson is doing with the original is, I mean, I'd almost call it, it's almost like Mormon flavored. And I think you were right there, Matt. It's like the language is sort of, just sort of scattered across that. And he takes the ideas and he takes the shapes of the stories, which he's obviously used to from his background and from his beliefs. And he uses those as a kind of a structuring principle for some of a lot of the deep background, a lot of the mythological aspect of what he's doing. And the modern show then takes that, gives that a sort of a weird sort of Greco-Roman sort of spin with some of the polytheistic gods that they worship, but also brings in this really fascinating sort of rival religion to it, because you look at the Cylons in the modern series, and they have this monoistic belief in this one true God, and it brings this sort of polytheism and this monotheism into conflict across the course of the show in a really fascinating way that has a lot more depth, I think, than the sprinkling of the sort of the Mormon themes that you get in the original series. You look at the structure on sort of a macro scale of the modern series in particular, and you look at even the way the episode titles reflect some of the things that are going on. And there's obvious examples there, like, The Hand of God, the episode where Baltar basically just, throws a dartboard or throws a dart at the board and said, yeah, blow that up and everything will be fine. And you're like, oh, actually, that worked out really well. But on a more subtle level, there's, I suppose an awful lot of people don't realize that the miniseries, the modern miniseries is titled Night. And the finale is titled Daybreak. And the whole sort of show kind of exists, obviously, between those two things. It exists as a sort of a philosophical, a spiritual, a dark night of the soul for the entire human race, which is brought to its lowest point and has to sort of somehow emerge from that with some kind of better understanding of themselves and their place in the universe. And I think on a very deep level, the religious themes are layered in both versions of these series, but they're doing very different things.
The difference in the zeitgeist that's happening in both of these versions as well, because obviously the 2003 version has very heavy, it's very influenced by the events of 9/11.
I think the 9/11 stuff in particular is really, it's there at the outset. This is a post 9/11 television show in every way, and there's a clear divide there between you get the I always say the last pre 9/11 show was, I don't know if anyone watched 7 Days. It was a really cheesy time travel show that it used to air like before Star Trek Voyager on UPN. And it was, the government back engineered time travel technology from the Roswell spacecraft. So every time something bad happened, they sent this crazy guy back in time to fix it. But it did this amazing thing that would never happen nowadays, where the title sequence of every episode showed like a plane flying into the White House and blowing it up.
Right.
And it's like, that's never going to happen on television ever again. Okay, let's all back away from that. But after that, you get this divide where it's, now everything is kind of like 24. Now everything is like very serious. Now we have to incorporate this into American science fiction or North American science fiction at an almost, I almost want to say at an almost genetic level. This becomes part of the storytelling, and you see that everywhere in Battlestar Galactica, the revised version of it. You see it in that thing. The Cylons now, they look like us, they talk like us, they act like us. They're literal sleeper agents. They could be anybody, and it catches that sense of paranoia that you got in the post 9/11 era of, maybe your neighbor is a sleeper agent. Maybe there's something going on there. What do they get up to when you don't see them? Who are they talking to? What's happening? And that, I think of the. Have you guys ever played the Battlestar Galactica board game?
No,
you should check this out. It does this thing where one of the players is a Cylon, and it's just decided randomly. And it is, I have seen this board game destroy people's relationships because everyone becomes so incredibly paranoid. It's like, what's going on? Who are you? What are you trying to do? And you see the same thing again. And you see it with the sort of the conflation of the military and the political stuff. You see it in the way in which Laura Roslin, the president, the brilliant character in this show, becomes very, very militant very quickly. She goes from, I was a school teacher to now I'm airlocking that dude because I'm not entirely sure who he is, very, very quickly. And it reflects that shift in American popular culture. And you see it more and more as it goes on. You see it in some of the torture stuff that you get in the second season. And I think there's background stuff going on there. There was a writer called Ann Saunders she was a researcher and a writer for 24. And she moved over to Battlestar Galactica, and she wrote episodes like Pegasus, and she wrote episodes like the second season finale. And she brought a lot of that research and that tone that they had been using on 24 over to what was going on here. And then you get to stuff like the third season, and you get to the new Caprica arc, which is, a type of storytelling that the 70s show could never do. And the new Caprica arc is, it's a reflection on an inversion of, American involvement in Iraq and Afghanistan. It's that sense of, you guys are familiar with, and I'm sure you've come across it, the theory of cognitive estrangement. So Darko Suvan was a critical theorist in science fiction, and he came up with this notion of cognitive estrangement. And science fiction is a thing that's cognitive, it happens in your brain, but it also involves estrangement. It involves this notion of, we've taken this this thing that you're familiar with, and we've made it weird so that you think about it more deeply and you go, oh, okay, that's actually what's going on there. All right, okay. And the third season, the new Caprica arc in the third season, like it takes these people who are essentially, you know, they're obviously they're white for one thing. They all look like catalog models, you know, for another thing, and it turns them into suicide bombers. And you're like, oh, okay, all right, I see what we're doing here. We're actually forcing people to think about maybe what you know, what's happening in the world nowadays. And there's very, very little storytelling like that has happened since. I'd put maybe the slightly off topic, I'd put maybe the fourth season of Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. up there with it in terms of, you know, the framework, in terms of the, like, oh, actually, this is fascism in the Western world, and this is how it takes over. And you're like, oh, you're doing the cognitive estrangement thing again. But it's a very, very brave show that does that, because it can be very off-putting to the audience. And I think the end of the new Caprica arc, I think that got some of the lowest ratings maybe of the third season, which is, you know, a shame, because it's an amazing storytelling.
Oh, so good though.
Yeah, and that last episode that has the Adama maneuver in it, I will be raving about the Adama maneuver forevermore. And trust me, I'm a Star Trek fan. Picard maneuver, that's pretty cool, but the Adama maneuver is so much better. No spoilers for anyone. Yeah,
I'm a Star Trek fan, but I actually don't think I could tell you off the top of my head what the Picard maneuver is. I'm aware that it's a thing in Star Trek, but I could probably like draw you a diagram of the Adama maneuver, right? Because it's one of my favorite moments in all of television ever. And that's actually like, that speaks to something else that Battlestar Galactica is doing, because it's doing all this amazing criticism of the American global political situation at the time contemporaneous to when it was being made, but it's also just making like incredibly enjoyable military science fiction as well. There are great battle scenes, likable soldier characters just trying to get the job done, a very, you know, Adama at the top of the tree, just this very stern, but he's always in the right and a good guy, and he tells everybody that he loves them all the time. Like, he's just this ideal of leadership within this military science fiction sort of context as well. So they're always doing that as well. That's also in dialogue, I think, with the space opera elements, isn't it? The military science fiction stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we talk about it as a space opera show, but in terms of other genres, it's absolutely a military SF show. I mean, there's elements of that in the 70s example. Obviously, you have the fighter pilots and you have the Vipers. As far as I remember, the show was so popular with naval aviators in the U.S. Navy at the time that even though they were flying Tomcats, they were flying the F-14s at the time, they rechristened them among themselves. They used to call them Vipers, just because they were like, those planes on the TV show are so cool. But the modern one absolutely is military science fiction, in terms of its thinking, in terms of the tactics, in terms of the fact that it's not just what we see in a lot of science fiction today, or, you know, throughout history, like, let's throw a bunch of model spaceships at each other and watch them explode. There's thought put into it. There's a difference between tactical approaches to things, strategic approaches to things. We will let these people die if we can accomplish the greater goal. There's a sense there of how do you outthink your enemy, and that makes it really very compelling television, because you see people like Adama, and you see people like Starbuck, especially in that first season where she's grounded for a while and she has to sort of go behind the scenes and like plan missions, and you're like, yeah, actually, how do you figure out how are you going to get to the asteroid to blow up the Tillium mine or whatever it is? How do you manage to get past the blockade? How do you outthink these people? It's not just pew, 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 you know, sort of the silly laser nonsense that we love from, you know, sort of traditional science fiction. It's thought through. Someone has sat down there with, you know, their military history books and their tactical books, and they've said, right, if we were to actually execute these operations, how would we go about it? And it makes it amazing television to watch.
And they borrow from like visual stuff from war movies, not just in the dogfights, like, which is a very familiar thing in space opera, but also just the set design, like the Galactica itself, especially the bridge with the beeping Dreadis, feels like a submarine, doesn't it? And that's completely different from how things were designed in the 78 series. The 78 series looks like every other ship's bridge, you know, of the time. But now it feels like we're on a nuclear submarine, hunkered down, scanning for enemies and all of that. That set design is amazing.
Yeah, the production design on the modern show, absolutely fantastic across the board. But we were talking about the bridge of the 70s show there. I mean, it's still got a window. It's still, Adama tells people, open the window, close the window. It's still doing that Star Trek thing where it's like, yeah, we're basically at the front of the ship now. And in actuality, the first thing that's going to happen is, if I was a smart Cylon, I'd throw a rocket in there. The nuclear submarine example you give there in terms of the modern one is exactly right, because where is the command center on the modern Galactica? It's deep in the heart of the ship. You can throw nuclear weapons at it, and occasionally a bit of glass breaks, but everyone carries on, and it feels like a real thing.
And that's really aided by the way that it's shot as well, because it's shot like this gritty documentary. It's got like crash zooms in there. All of the space fights aren't how you would usually see like the dogfights in space, like in a Star Wars with the grand spectacle. They're all sort of, it's like you're following the action with some guerrilla documentarian just covering it all. I think that really just adds an extra aspect to it and brings the action to life.
Yeah, it makes it feel real. You get, you get shots of the space battles from like the gun cameras. Essentially, you feel like you're being thrown around, and obviously you guys can't see me now, but if you're listening to me, I'm literally going from side to side at the moment. You feel like you're being thrown around the place when the ship banks to this side or that side. You don't really get that in the 70s one. As delightful as it is, it's clearly Dirk Benedict in a cardboard box, going vroom vroom vroom. It doesn't feel quite as real. The modern one is messy and it's ugly and it's gritty, as you say there. It feels like this is a lived-in place, somewhere that soldiers and pilots and people are they're living and breathing and dying, and there's blood and there's dirt, and the whole place becomes more and more broken down as the 4 years of the show carry on. And I think that's very much a Ron Moore thing about it. It's like, yeah, we've done the Star Trek Voyager thing. It's always fine. The ship blew up last week, but it's okay now. But after New Caprica and after the Adama maneuver, we'll say, yeah, that whole spacecraft is wrecked, and it never quite recovers from that, which obviously becomes a plot point in season 4. But it feels again like it's trying to do justice to the military end of military science fiction.
I'll just give a shout out to Zoic Studios there. That's the name of the production company that made the special effects for Battlestar Galactica. They also did Firefly, which is why Firefly looks very similar, the space scenes. But they're very good. Like they were top of their game in the early 2000s. I don't know what they're doing at the moment, but all those flash zooms and stuff. There's a scene where a camera gets physically knocked by a bit of debris and goes spinning, I think in the miniseries or early on. It just goes along with that kind of post 9/11 war reporting that's going on. It's the visual signifiers of war in action that audiences were seeing on TV at the time, and you want to feel like you're there in the moment in space.
The Serenity, actually, there's a little cameo appearance in the miniseries, apparently.
Is there? Oh, lovely.
Yeah. It's like when they're on Caprica, it's there for a second. I've seen it online. So, yeah, it's a blink and you miss it moment, but it's a nice little Easter egg for the series.
Copy and paste from the Zoic files.
Yeah. When Rosalind is in the doctor's office, I think if you look up at you can see out through the skylight, essentially, and you can kind of see
Yeah.
Hey there, listeners. Have you ever wanted more than just our regular podcast episodes? Well, you're in luck.
Yes! All right!
That's right. If you're enjoying the show and want to support what we do, you can sign up to our Patreon by going to patreon.com/journey through sci-fi and get access to our regular bonus episodes.
We've got the Bad Movie Bunker over there, where we dive deep into the best of the worst and the worst of the worst in sci-fi cinema.
Bad
Movie
Bunker.
And if you've ever wanted to have a say on what we review, check out our Patrons Picks, where our patrons get to choose their favourite undiscovered sci-fi gems for us to dissect and discuss.
Patrons Pick.
But that's not all, folks. We're always keeping our feed up to date with the latest in science fiction cinema. You'll get the freshest reviews, along with exclusive miniseries covering the biggest and best sci-fi franchises.
So if you're ready for an even deeper dive into our sci-fi universe, become a patron today and unlock exclusive bonus episodes that you won't find anywhere else.
We hope to see you there, but for now, let's get back to the episode. Obviously, as an expert in subgenres of various fiction, are there any other sort of genres you would put this this series in as well, Val? Is there anything that springs to mind that's sort of incorporating in there?
Either of them as well, the 78 or the 2003 version.
I think there are definite moments of what we might think of as science fantasy in there. The 78 one, you think about the mythological stuff. Obviously, you think about I don't know if you managed to rewatch, Matthew, the Ship of Lights stuff, where it's essentially the space gods.
Because it sounded terrible.
Yeah, and it's a tonal thing again. No, you're right. It's a tonal thing again in terms of like how do we jump from one genre or one subgenre to another subgenre? You see it a little bit as well in the modern one in terms of the stuff, especially that happened. And I'll try not to give any spoilers here. The stuff that happens in season 4. There's some of the stuff that relates to, I will call it God as a character rather than God as an idea, because there's that sense there of God as a presence maybe that you get in the especially in the 3rd and 4th season of the reimagined show. But it's God not as a kindly person with a big beard in the sky. It's more like this sort of like mechanistic entity that really doesn't care. And you're like, oh yeah, but you've given it that sense of character. But it strays a couple of events into what I would think of as science fantasy, which is very close, obviously, to Star Wars and things like that.
It's interesting that Ron Moore retained that religious element, and I know that Glen Larson wasn't too happy about aspects of the reimagined series, and I wonder if that was one of the things that pissed him off a bit, because it removes a big chunk of the Christianity and the Mormonism, or removes or inverts and changes and chops and changes. The colonials are not Mormon anymore; they're polytheistic. So that, I don't know if that would have upset Larson, but yeah, I think we're fine to talk. We're fine to include spoilers. You alluded to the ending being a bit controversial. I remember not liking it when I first saw it, and on reflection, it's because as a nerdy sci-fi guy who's not religious, I had just discounted for 4 seasons any element of religion, basically, in Battlestar Galactica, with a bit of a shrug and been like, oh, I guess it's something else, I just completely discounted it. And then I got a bit blindsided by the ending because of that. But on rewatching it, you do notice that, God is a character in the reimagined series. God is a real force in the reimagined series.
I think a lot of us, especially who watched most of our television in the late 80s and early 90s, I think we got very comfortable with the Star Trek notion that anytime God or a God shows up, it's probably an evil computer.
Exactly. Yes, exactly. Yes.
Yeah, and you're like, yeah, that'll be fine. That's not really anything important. And yeah, I think a lot of people were like, they were happy to write it off as just, oh, those kooky colonials and they're and those Cylons and their crazy God. What's going on with that? And they're like, oh, this is actually a core part of the show. Whoopsie. And it was a surprise. And I think that, to an extent, the same thing happened with Lost in a very similar time frame. Yeah. You were like, hold on, this is actually there all along. What's going on with this? And they both rejected, or both finales were kind of rejected by large segments of the fan base as a consequence. But you look back on them now and you think, yeah, actually, you probably nailed this, but no one wanted to admit it at the time. I think some of the stuff there maybe with... So when I was talking about not giving any spoilers, some of the stuff that happens with Starbuck in season 4, some of the stuff is she dead? Is she alive? Is she real? Is she not? Is she a ghost? Is she a spirit? Is she an angel? What's happening there? I think a lot of people maybe were like, okay, let's just back away slowly from that. And it's the point at which some people disengage from the show, obviously, but it is part of the show's narrative universe. It's part of the story world, and you kind of... It's absolutely fine to love just parts of the show, but I think as an audience member, maybe we need to acknowledge that there's more going on there. Maybe we don't like it, but there's more happening there. Same thing happened to an extent with Deep Space Nine, obviously, and you have more there, and he's using Avery Brooks's character of Captain Sisko as a sort of like, yes, he's this rational representation of the Enlightened Federation, but he's also Space Jesus. He's wormholes.
Deep Space. I'm such a big Deep Space Nine fan. I think Deep Space Nine sidestepped that issue in my mind because the prophets are aliens, and it's as simple as that. Like, they are both aliens and gods. They're aliens that have been interpreted by the Bajorans as gods, and that for me that's perfectly, that sits within my sci-fi brain, and I don't feel blindsided by any twists and turns there. Aliens have got special powers. I don't understand them. I'm not an alien. So anything these aliens do to Cisco works for me. I've got no complaints.
Maybe we can rationalize God on Battlestar Galactica in the same way. Maybe it is an alien. There's no other aliens on the show, but maybe.
Could be, or I'm now on rewatching happy to accept that God is God in this universe. And similarly, I mean, you mentioned Lost. It's a great comparison. I recently rewatched that as well, and that was another one that I was very disappointed, livid when I watched the finale. And rewatching it, I just loved it. You know, you're just going with the flow, and you can understand everything as a whole in its whole context. And Battlestar's the same. Rewatching it, accepting that in this universe, God is a physical presence, or not quite physical presence, that it just improves the experience, I think. And it speaks to my own arrogance, I think, as a viewer, to think like, oh, well, you know, I know better than to accept what's on screen.
See, you're experiencing cognitive estrangement. You're doing the thing. You're doing what science fiction is supposed to do.
Yeah, which I couldn't do as a teenager, to be fair, when I was watching it the first time, or I wasn't interested in doing. And you get more out of these shows, don't you, with some cognitive estrangement to really assess them and get inside them and be a bit less emotional about them when the finale comes around and you don't like it.
They became part of our identities there for a while, didn't they? I mean, I don't know about you guys, but
yes,
like something like Lost, like became just who I was for about 5 or 6 years. I was, my God, I would never forget.
But you guys are both right. It's those expectations that you have of a series like this. You want the answers when you first watch it. And then when you can sort of take that step back with a rewatch and be like, okay, I know that I'm not going to get all the answers. I'm fine with that. Then you can kind of watch it and appreciate it in a different way. I think one of the other interesting things about the series are, of course, its characters, which we've talked a lot about already, but they do so many different things with the characters compared to the 70s version. They've got certain characters which are gender swapped, their relationships are expanded upon, there's lots of stuff going on. They've had more time to develop them, obviously, but they feel more nuanced. And there's this move away from this family space opera of the 70s where it's very much like, okay, here's a kid and his robot dog, like we said earlier, and there's like a sort of a family element. You've got the father-son relationship, and it's all very sort of nicey nice TV of the time kind of thing. But it's very much more gritty and developed in this 2003 version. What did you guys think about the various characters? Who were the interesting ones to you when you were watching this series?
I think in terms of the 70s one, I think the Adama character in the 70s one, I mean, he's close in many respects to modern Adama. He's still a brilliant leader. He's still the only person there who can kind of outthink, you know, what's going on with the Cylons. He's the only person there who basically has the strength to say, no, we run away now because we're not going to win this. And there's that great scene in the 70s one where the Galactica just pulls away from the fleet and you just know everyone else is going to get blown up. And he's like, no, actually, we're not going to win this. We need to run and hide, frankly. And he outthinks them again later on the disco planet, we'll say, where he's like, yeah, I see something's going on here. That's what I'm calling it now, the disco planet.
That's good. I like that.
Yeah. Where, you know, he says, yeah, actually, let's make sure that our pilots are not, you know, caught in this like really obvious trap that no one else can see. So in some respects, I think he stood out. I mean, he's not a patch on Edward James Olmos, who gives one of the great performances of all time as Commander Adama in the modern show. And again, as you say, it's nuanced, it's weighty, it changes, it transforms. And in some respects, the modern show, it has the time, as you say, but it also has the willingness to allow its characters to change and to allow its characters. Like he begins absolutely despising Laura Roslin as like, who is this school teacher giving me orders, telling me what to do, and grows to respect her, and they grow to rely on each other, and eventually they, again, spoiler alert, eventually they fall in love. Which, if you said that at the outset, everyone would say that's going to be the cheesiest thing that will ever. And it becomes this amazing, you know, mature, and I don't mean in terms of ages changes. I mean, in terms of the weight of it, it becomes this very mature love story where you see you understand what they see in each other. Adding Laura Roslin as the presidential character in the miniseries, the modern miniseries, brilliant choice. Works very well. Obviously not a character in the 70s show. 70s show, you have Richard Hatch and Dirk Benedict. I said it half an hour ago and it's gone out of my brain. And they're very good at what they do. I think Hatch is possibly better. Hatch, who eventually becomes, a separate character entirely on the modern show. He becomes, a terrorist leader and a politician in the modern show. I think he has a better sense of what's going on. I think Dirk Benedict is chewing the scenery as much as he's chewing cigars in that original series. He says, yeah, I'm just there. There's a woman. I'm going to point myself at her and see what happens. As Starbuck, I think he's quite one-dimensional. He lacks a lot of what Katie Sackhoff brings to the Starbuck character, the completely reimagined Starbuck character in the modern series. And what I like about what Sackhoff does there is that other shows, lesser shows, would have made a big deal out of it. It's like, right, you're a woman. What's it like to be a woman? They're just like, nah, she's a pilot. Just deal with it. She's the best pilot. Also deal with that while you're at it. And I think the characterization and the strength and the sort of the depth that Sackhoff brings to that is fantastic. And again, changes and morphs and is challenged in numerous ways across the modern show in a way that Dirk Benedict, who was a lot of fun, and we all loved him in the A-Team obviously as well, which has a fun Battlestar Galactica moment in many of its credit sequences where you see him at like Universal Studios or something, standing beside a Cylon going, wait, do I know that guy? He's fun in it. He's good in it, but I think he's not given the type of material to work with here that Katie Sackhoff is given in the modern show,
or even that Richard Hatch is given in the original show as well. Like he is just a more interesting character, Apollo, than Starbuck.
Yeah.
But I would also say that there's something about Dirk Benedict doing Dirk Benedict that is pretty irresistible and fun, and I can't think of seeing him in much stuff apart from this in the A-Team, but he's got that down. Like he's got that absolutely locked down, that type of character, and I love to see him all the time. For me, I agree with all of those characters and your assessment of them, but for me, like Baltar is the one that stands out across both series. I absolutely love Count Baltar. He's a perfect hammy, cheesy space opera villain. Damn you, Adama! Curse you, Galactica! I'll blow you out of the skies. He's so entertaining. He's so camp. He's really funny. And then he's reimagined into Gaius Baltar, who is one of the greatest characters in fiction of all time. He's perfect. James Callis is mesmerizing in every scene he's in Battlestar Galactica. I never get tired of seeing him. He's also very camp and very funny and slightly ridiculous, but there's depth there, and you are so in his head, if you pardon the pun. You're so in the head of the character throughout the series. Him and Starbuck, I think, just sort of understanding their mentality throughout the series, they get that really laser focus on them as characters, and seeing them develop over the 4 seasons is amazing.
Yeah, James Callis's work it's just stunning because what you get in the 70s Baltar is brilliant for what he's being asked to do, be the big bombastic hammy space opera villain. He's perfect at it, and you still have elements of that in the modern version. You still have some elements of that with Callis, but there's that sort of self-serving, that the depth of that self-serving. I am going to survive somehow. I don't care how many of you guys aren't going to. I am going to survive somehow. But also, I kind of hate myself at the same time. and there's so many angles. So he's a brilliant actor. He showed up on Picard, Star Trek Picard in the 2nd season, in a very pivotal role. And you're like, no, that's not. Oh, that works. Yeah, you nailed that. Well done, Mr. Callis. He also shows up in. Have you guys ever seen a Portlandia sketch called One More Episode?
I don't think so.
No, okay, so stick this into YouTube afterwards and have a look at this. And you have two characters, and they're like, hey, we're supposed to go out and meet my friend tonight, but I just got this DVD, this Battlestar Galactica show. Do you guys want to watch this? And they become obsessed with it over the course of the thing, and they watch the whole thing, and their lives basically fall apart because, they get fired from their jobs, and they don't, pay their electricity bill and stuff because they're watching. And then they run out of the show, and they're like, oh my God, what are we going to... So they write their own episode, and they get James Callis. I think is Edward James almost in it as well, and Ron Moore, who shows up and is like, I'm just a local actor. I'll do a couple of scenes for you here, and who show up to read their terrible Battlestar Galactica fan fiction episode. And Callis is all in on it as well. He's just, he's very, very committed to it. So, but yeah, Baltar, love Baltar, hate Baltar. Good God, I hate Baltar. Don't hate him as much as Gaeta, Felix Gaeta, one of my most. Yeah, and here's the thing: Gaeta is completely innocuous for the majority of the show. He's just there. He's just kind of the guy. Yeah. He's Radar from MASH. He's just there. Or Walter from Stargate. He's just, he's pushing the buttons, whatever. And he has this heel turn in season 4. And again, spoiler alert. So cover your ears for a second if you don't want to hear. But in the Mutiny 2-parter in season 4, which is, as far as I'm concerned, two of the greatest hours of the show. And I will never, ever, ever, ever forgive Felix Gaeta for what he does in those episodes. And it retroactively kind of colors every time I see him on screen now. I'm just like, oh, that guy. Or anytime actually he shows up in anything else. He showed up in, I think he was in the Chilling Adventures of Sabrina there a few years ago. He shows up as the magic shop owner or something. And I'm like, Gaeta! It's so some very strong reactions to some of these characters. I even today, even after so many years,
it speaks to the writing and the acting. It's wall to wall legendary characters. James, what about you? Who are some of your favourites from both series?
Well, I think all of the ones you've mentioned. I mean, Katie Sackhoff as Starbuck, the way that she's portrayed, the reasons for why she's a hotshot pilot and all of the baggage that comes with that is so well put together. And like we said, Gaius is just amazing. And Gaius is so fascinating because it's all through, he's just a very weak character. He doesn't do anything out of malice, it doesn't seem like, but he is just out to save his own skin. So he's great. But it's just all the other background characters. There are so many characters. There's a plethora of brilliant, brilliant performances in this. And they all just come out bit by bit. I mean, even in the miniseries, I think I heard somewhere that the writers had so much love for certain characters in the miniseries who they originally planned to kill off. They just brought them back.
Lieutenant Agaton. I forget his call sign now, but yeah, they were like, he was just supposed to be in the miniseries, and they're like, actually, he's kind of cool. We love working with this guy. Let's keep him on. Yeah.
And the way they develop Ty's character as well, this alcoholic.
Oh, Ty's brilliant.
Yeah, and just how bringing his wife on board and adding that element to it, and his relationship there, and and then the chief and his relationship to Boomer, and then the second Boomer, the second Sharon model that we find out about later on. It's just, there's so much depth to the show.
The work that Grace Park does with the Boomers or Boomer and Athena, and they're two completely different people. I kind of, as the show goes on, first season apart now because they kind of, obviously the characters develop, but as the show goes on, I don't like Boomer. I don't like her at all. Athena, brilliant, love her, fantastic. She's a great character. It's the same person. It's both in terms of the performer, but obviously they're both the same model of Cylon. They should be, but they're not. They're completely different people. And the way in which she very finely draws the distinctions between the two of them until they've moved so completely apart. By the time you get to the end of the show, you're like, that's fantastic acting. That's just really cool. The other person I was thinking of was, in terms of background people, essentially was Romo Lampkin as the lawyer, the crazy lawyer who shows up at the end of season 3, I want to say, when Gaius Baltar is on trial, and they get the last lawyer in the fleet to defend him, and he's just crazy. It's Mark Shepard shows up, and he's brilliant, and he's so good they bring him back in season 4 several times. Yeah, a lot of love for those performers and those characters.
And of course, number 6 as well, Trisha Helfer. What a performance from her. As this sort of femme fatale who's also may or may not be God in some form.
Or a Cylon chip in Gaius's head, maybe.
Yeah. Still clinging on to it.
No, but that's how it's played. That's how she plays it for season 1.
Yeah, but she's great as well. And just out of nowhere, it seems like she came into this program and just... Yeah, it's
and
brilliant
became
performance.
the base of the program in many ways, But plays, I don't know how many different versions of Number 6 she plays in the course of that show, like 4 or 5 at least, and they're all, again, they're like Boomer. They're all very finely distinguished individuals, and they feel like different people.
I think I've talked about this before on the podcast, James, but it's something that I absolutely love in TV and film is when good actors, get the opportunity to play different versions of the same character, and they get to have fun with that, but also flex their acting muscles and doing all the things that you were just saying about Grace Park's performance in particular as Boomer and Athena, just bringing out the nuance to create 2 different characters basically out of them. And this show gets to do that. It's like one of my favorite things to see, and you get to see the 2 sides of it really as well, because number 8, Boomer and Athena, Sharon, is really just those 2 versions. There's other number 8s, but it's really, though you've got 2 core ones, and Grace Park gets to explore 2 characters on screen across 4 seasons. Trisha Helfer gets to do the fun one, which is that she's got a main role, and then every 6 or 7 episodes, another 6 will pop up that's completely different from the one that we know. And then she gets to do that. Like, there's a brilliant season 1 episode where she shows up accusing Baltar of what he did, what he actually did, which is cause the downfall of humanity. And that's the first time I think that we see that we have sort of a proper, speaking role for her as a different 6. And then, she just gets, it's mostly them for Helfer. She just gets like bit roles as a different one, and she's clearly having a lot of fun with it. But I think those 2 actors really take the cake for it. There's many other Cylons, but those 2 really are the ones that they're just amazing to see them doing different versions of their Cylons.
Helfer does very, very strong work, like dramatic work in season 2 in the Pegasus arc as the version of number 6 who was like captured aboard the Pegasus, and as this abused woman who has been chained up into sort of the ship's dungeon essentially, and has been completely physically and mentally destroyed by these people, and bringing that sort of pain to the screen and realizing that in a way that it's not exploitative, it's not cheesy. It doesn't feel like it's just, we're just going to do the tortured woman plot line. It feels like we are going to spend time on this woman's pain and experience and explore what it means to her, and explore how she might be able to, recover or not, as the case may be, from this situation. And I think the work that Helfer does with that, it's serious, dramatic, award-worthy work. Yeah.
And it's crucial at that point in the plot as well, because it's through her that we understand Kane and the Pegasus. It's also through Kane herself, but we need to see that pain and the pain that has been caused by Kane and the Pegasus crew, and it needs to be a face that we are familiar with and sort of trust to tell the story to us, and that's all vital stuff. And you're absolutely right. It's performance of a lifetime in those episodes for her.
So Battlestar, the 2003 version, ended in 2009, but there were a few spin-offs and attempts to sort of recapture that hype after it. And I mean, it had lots of problems towards the end of the run, didn't it? There was the writer's strike, which influenced it to a degree, but they managed to get that core 4 series out. Are you guys familiar with any of the sort of the spin-off stuff that happened after they released that main series?
I mean, the two examples that jump out, and there's a couple of other things around that, but the 2 main examples that jump out to me are probably the television show Caprica, which ran for 1 series, which was this prequel that took place, however 50 years beforehand or however long that was, about the creation of the Cylons and about the roots of the Adama family, and it kind of follows. Follows Adama's grandfather, who's this like mob lawyer on the planet Caprica, while simultaneously it's following like the guy who created the Cylons originally and gave them consciousness, gave them the consciousness of his daughter who had died in a terrorist bombing, who was part of this monoistic cult. this controversial cult, and that's where like the belief in the single god that the Cylons have comes from. It comes from this teenage girl's essentially social media that her distraught dad downloaded and uploaded into the brain of a killer robot, and you're like, this is just so crazy. It actually makes sense. And there's great performances in it. It's the actors are great and everything, but what it does is it kind of explores the intellectual or the philosophical half of the Battlestar Galactica series and makes it its own TV show. You look at Blood and Chrome, which was meant to be a spin-off, but eventually just ended up being like a TV movie. That takes the sort of the space opera, action adventure, military SF side and turns it into a whole. And again, it's about a young Adama, on his first mission, and it's basically William Adama if William Adama was Starbuck. And he's this hot shot pilot, and they go on this mission to the planet, and there's he has the affair with the scientist lady, and they meet the early Cylons, and everything blows up, and you're just like, actually this is kind of weirdly fun, but possibly not weighty enough to be an entire TV show, because it was kind of missing that sort of more, as I said, the more intellectual component that went over to Caprica. Caprica unfortunately didn't last either, but it was a really intriguing sort of fun show to explore for a while.
That's interesting as an aspect of it, because so often in space opera we talk about franchising and everything having spin-offs and different shows and different sequels, and just turning Battlestar into two separate entities like Caprica and Blood and Chrome. I think that's a really fun way of doing it, but I think there's also a danger in that, because when we talked about the Star Wars prequels recently, they almost explain away too much of what happened. And I think that when I remember watching Caprica when it came out, and that was one of my fears with it, because as much as it's interesting to hear about this backstory, part of me wants to have a bit of that not knowing all of the elements of the show.
I think that was my reaction to Caprica as well. Val, your sort of your assessment of how they split them apart is really interesting. That one took the kind of high concept, high minded stuff, and one took the military SF action. I hadn't really thought of that, but that is absolutely what they've done. But I think the problem is that you're splitting a great show into less than the sum of its parts, and then you get two not so good shows. I quite liked Blood and Chrome, but I think it works better as what it became, like a one-off TV movie or however they structured it. I'm happy to watch like 90 minutes of young Adama fighting some Cylons. It's a bit fun. I don't know if we could do 4 seasons of that. I just don't think there's any substance there. And then with Caprica, I got lost in the VR. I just did not. I couldn't get on board with Caprica. I thought it was too weird. All the stuff you were just describing about it's a teen girl's social media that created the Cylons, I was like, what the hell? I don't have time for this. So I kind of gave up on it there. But they're thinking about rebooting it, I think, or much like any sort of popular IP, there's always going to be some hungry dogs sniffing around out there. But there are rumours, aren't there, of a reboot? Do you think it would work again? I was looking at the dates and I did realise that we are edging ever closer to the same gap of time between between 1978 and 2003 as 2003 in present day. In 5 years' time, we will have reached that point. So we're due a Battlestar Galactica.
I saw that. I saw that span of time in one of the emails you guys sent me earlier, and I was like, "Oh God, they're right." And I just had this really cool moment of are people nowadays, and I'm sure this is exactly what's happening. Are people nowadays looking back at us in the early 2000s, and they're the same way that we look back at the 70s and think that was nonsense? What were you doing on the disco planet? That's crazy. And it's like, do people think we were on the disco planet? What's going on with that? But yeah, it will probably get rebooted because it's an intellectual property that Hollywood owns. They're like, well, we could buy a new one, or let's rummage through the box and see what we can. Hey, Battlestar Galactica, people like that, right? I kind of feel like the 2000s one is so definitive that is there a point in telling the story again? I'm sure somebody thinks the same about the 70s one. No, Glen Larson thinks the same about the 70s one, obviously. But there's a sense there of how are you going to tell that story again? It's so rooted in its time and its place, like all science fiction is, in the time and the place of its creation or its composition. You know, it is this post 9/11, you know, reboot of science fiction and space opera as a concept and something that is serious and grown up for a serious and grown up world where there's no easy truths, where there's no easy answers. There's no, in many ways, there's no good guys or bad guys. It's all shades of gray. I don't know what that would look like today. I wonder sometimes if maybe something that would exist maybe alongside that universe or alongside the stories that we've seen so far might be a good idea. I always think about the end of the New Caprica arc. I think you guys left thousands of people behind on that planet. Whatever happened to them? You know, what's going on New Caprica, you know, 25 years later? Is it all crazy religious people who took over, like the Geminon people who are like, you know, really super conservatives, or have they found a spaceship? Have they gone out themselves? What's going on? Something like that, maybe.
Or you could do a Galactica 1980 thing where the people who are left on New Caprica come to modern day Earth and get superpowers on Earth for some reason. And then you could do that like 25,000 years later.
Oh God, yeah, the less said about the aerial speed bikes or whatever it is in Galactica 1980, and they're still wearing the helmets from the Vipers, from the fighter planes, and they're on these sort of terrible blue screen aerial bikes. Yeah, Galactica 1980 is a trip. Yeah, if ever there was a trip, that's a trip.
Yeah, and again, that was another attempt to keep a series going, wasn't it? It was, what do we do with this show now? Oh, let's do a bit of time travel, throw in a bit of this and that, and keep the costs down, and turn it into every other like TV show on at the moment, sort of buddy cop almost. And yeah, we don't want to see Battlestar turn into something like that.
No, Battlestar Galactica Chips is more what it was than Battlestar Galactica in 1980. You know, it was, yeah. Ooh, it's a rough show.
But I think we're all in agreement that Battlestar, I think the definitive version is that 03 version, but it's so interesting looking at how it changed from that 70s one. And if that hadn't existed, we wouldn't have got this. So, I mean, it all works out in the end, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely does.
Brilliant. Well, it has been fantastic having you on, Val. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you so much, Val.
Yeah, thank you guys. It has been an enormous amount of fun. Always happy to talk about science fiction TV shows. Literally, it spares other people from having to, in my life, from having to listen to me ramble on and on about them. So thank you guys very much for having me and inviting me to do this.
Thank you so much. And where can people find you online if you want to be found? Where can they find your work?
You can find me. I used to say you can find me on Twitter, but now you can find me on Blue Sky if you're looking for me. You can find me at Valascula Rule, which is a very deep cut reference to naval law that I use as my social media handle. So you guys can check that out if you want. And if anyone wants to hear more about subgenres and how to write them, please do check out Spec Fic For Newbies, which is available from Luna Press or any good bookstore or books website that you might normally go to.
Yes, definitely. Make sure you check that out, listeners. It's a great book and we fully recommend it. Val, hopefully we'll have you on again sometime in the future. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you, Val.
Thank you very much.
Thanks again to Val for joining us. That was a really fun chat. And do remember to check out Val on Blue Sky and check out Val and Tiff's book, Spec Fic For Newbies, available where all good books are sold or from Luna Press.
Yes, and if listening to us talk about Battlestar Galactica has whetted your appetite for more Battlestar, you can find it on BBC iPlayer, which is where I watched all of those episodes.
Yeah, I can't believe it's all for free on iPlayer. That's great. That's where I've been watching it as well. Good old iPlayer. Sorry, American audience. Sorry, non-UK audience.
But there you go. That's a helpful hint from us. So what have we got coming up for the listeners next time on the podcast, Matt? Where are we going in the world of space opera on our journey through sci-fi?
We're checking out some blue people on fantastic planets as we deal with a pretty big movie in this topic, James. It's James Cameron's Avatar and also Fantastic Planet.
Yes, Fantastic Planet or La Planète Sauvage.
Very good, James.
As you might say in the original tongue.
And L'Avatar.
L'Avatar. Yes, I'm very excited to talk about blue people next time on the podcast. I'm sure it will be a fantastic episode. Blue people galore next time on the podcast.
And oppressed nations on fantastical space opera worlds as well, I guess, is the more serious theme that we're going to be be dealing with next time on the show, isn't it?
Yeah, Press Nation's not so fantastic, but it will be interesting to dive into these space operas next time on the show.
So join us for that, folks. We will be back soon. Thanks for listening to this episode of Journey Through Sci-Fi.
You can find us at journeythroughsci-fi.com, where you can find links to our social media and join the conversation.
If you've enjoyed what you've heard and want to support us, why not leave us a review on your podcast app of choice? It really helps new people find the show.
You can also support us on Patreon at patreon.com/journeythroughsci-fi, where you can receive exclusive bonus episodes every month.
Don't forget to subscribe to the show, and we'll see you again next time for another Journey Through Sci-Fi.